Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. On today's episode, social registries and beyond. Social protection systems are, of course, underpinned by data. However they're designed or targeted, programs need to be able to collect and store data on potential beneficiaries so that they can be evaluated against eligibility criteria and eventually enrolled into programs. These databases are often called social registries, although there are other names and we'll get into some of that today. It sounds simple enough, but building these registries in low and middle income countries where data is often scarce presents enormous challenges. Finding ways for them to be truly dynamic so that programs can respond effectively to people's changing circumstances is perhaps one of the greatest challenges facing our sector. And social registries in particular have long been critiqued due to their association with poverty targeting. In this episode, we'll go beyond the periodic controversy to talk about how social registries work as part of broader information ecosystems and how we can make them work better to meet the challenges of our time. We have two guests for today's episode. Rodrigo Assumpção is president of DataPrev in Brazil, which is a public company responsible for the ICT underpinnings of Brazil's social programs, including Cadastro Único, the Social Assistance Registry, and the Social Security Registry for social security programs in Brazil. And Valentina Barca is a social protection expert who has worked extensively on digitisation and how information systems can be best designed to serve the sector. Welcome, Rodrigo and Valentina.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Rodrigo, can I start with you? What are the main functions of social registries within that broader realm of social protection information systems, and how do they underpin programs and delivery?
To answer that, I'd like to step slightly back. I think all countries are at the moment facing the challenge of building their national data infrastructure. So basically, all the data a country needs to exist, to survive. So societies are building that. That includes everything that government produces, everything that the social sector produces, everything that academia produces, everything that the private sector produces. And within that context of a national data infrastructure, you have social data. And within social data, then historically, we have huge chunks of data concerning social security, social assistance, health, education, and lots of other stuff. That's how I think you have to understand these things, because you're not building something that is completely independent, will stand alone. It's part of something bigger and ever evolving. And of course, unfortunately, countries are not equipped equally to deal with this issue. We're talking here about public policies. You're shifting either money or resources and applying them to some defined use. Then, of course, you need to identify where this use is going to happen, with whom you're going to be relating. And then, of course, there's all kinds of priorities, all kinds of qualifications. But you need to have an identification of either the people or the families or the social sectors or the wealth and income percentiles. You have to have some kind of definition. So you need data about that. Here in Brazil, we started off 25 years ago by basically registering with the municipalities who were the people who were below certain levels of poverty. That's what the terms we were using. And of course, we joined up benefits that were pre-existing. So there was a gas program, a combat against hunger program. There was a program to have some kind of defined social assistance. And when we joined all this together and put one registry available for, now it's nearly 100 programs that are using all around the country at the federal, municipal, and state level, then you have an extremely powerful tool that keeps on evolving. We have used this tool to combat the effects of ecological disasters, so floods and fires. We have used this tool to select the people who needed financial help after these things. We are now preparing to use this tool in our tax reform. So all kinds of uses can be done once you have a qualified database.
Vale, let me come to you. There have been various efforts to develop typologies describing different types of registries or management information systems. And that has given rise to a range of terms that can frankly become confusing. Social registries, integrated or unified beneficiary registries, integrated management information systems, MIS or IMIS, even single registries. How should people understand this somewhat confusing space?
Yeah, so it goes back to kind of what Rodrigo was hinting at, that some of these are just pieces within a broader ecosystem, and each piece plays a different function. And those functions evolve over time and they evolve differently in different countries, and that history matters. And in fact, kind of different countries have ended up calling their systems in different ways for historical reasons. Very often countries start with different programs doing things independently. They're going through those same functions, but each program is going through those same functions in a very bitty, fragmented way. They're reinventing the wheel. They're asking kind of people to develop their own softwares for their own program MISs, or what the bank is now calling beneficiary operation management systems. But ultimately, if we stop thinking of each piece as sort of a registry, but we think of the functions, I think it's a lot easier to start speaking a common language. So when we're talking about that social registry function, we're talking about that intake and registration into the system. And it can either happen each individual program doing it, or we could do it across programs, and different programs could have the same gateway, the same sort of intake of data, and we'll come to how we do that later. And then that data is used to feed into many different programs with different eligibility criteria, so that it's that function. While an integrated beneficiary registry function is the function of taking the data back from individual programs to have that overview of who's receiving what across programs, to be able to do M&E budgeting, planning with it. And in fact, once we've done that, we can also go further and start to integrate operations, kind of integrate our payments, integrate our grievance mechanisms, etc. So I would invite everyone to stop obsessing over the language. Let's just call it whatever we call it in country, but let's just think about the functions in the background, recognize that the international community has sort of consolidated the way we speak about this in certain documents, which can be helpful. And just always clarify what you mean when you use a word, so that we know we're speaking the same language when we talk.
As Rodrigo was also starting to say, these are ultimately policies and decisions governments are making that need to be operationalized through these systems. So, upstream policy choices about how to ration social protection, who is eligible or deserving in different contexts, and therefore what kinds of targeting approaches are used. All of those shape the development of information systems and social registries, because they are being tasked with
Mhm.
operationalizing those choices. And I think we have become perhaps used to associating certain policy choices with certain kinds of
Mhm.
systems. So, for example, when I think of an archetypal social registry, or the ones that I worked with some years ago, I associate those with poverty targeting. This idea that countries collect socioeconomic information on households, then establish some kind of ranking or an eligibility threshold that determines who's poor enough to qualify for programs. And it's that list that is held in the social registry and sometimes almost becomes synonymous with the social registry. And that's a model that's been widely replicated, particularly by the World Bank and others. But Valentina, what's wrong with what I've just set out there? Is that an oversimplification? What are some of the other ways that policy and targeting choices affect the way these systems are constructed?
I wouldn't call it an oversimplification. I'd call it a sort of quite honest characterization of what has been happening in a lot of countries. And it's been happening for a reason. I mean, especially at country level, the World Bank has been operationalizing social registries as a tool to implement proxy means test targeting. But that doesn't mean that, in fact, even at headquarters at the bank, the thinking has shifted far beyond that. The international community working on information systems and thinking about the function of social registries has gone far beyond that. And kind of the overall consensus among experts and those of us working in the sector and across the agencies, ILO also at the forefront, is that things don't have to be this way. We can be building, in fact, we should be building social registries as a tool to be able to feed into a wide variety of programs, as Rodrigo was mentioning, with a wide variety of targeting mechanisms and eligibility criteria. And they need to be built fit for purpose in order to be doing this. And we need to get this right up front. So this is something really crucial, that the social registry doesn't do the eligibility determination. The social registry makes sure that the data is there, that we have the right types of data. It might even be doing that ranking, but it doesn't mean that programs need to adopt that ranking. Or maybe even the countries that do adopt the ranking might use it for affluence testing. Maybe they can just remove the ones really at the kind of very high end of the income spectrum and get rid of those and keep everyone else. Or they could ignore the poverty targeting altogether and go for categorical type targeting or kind of vulnerability type targeting, looking at certain types of eligibility criteria. So it's more about kind of making sure that we're pushing back where we see countries that are really stuck in this way of thinking. And even in quite recent contexts, which have been building their social registries recently, I have seen the pushback working. Most recently, Mauritania, the Gambia are two examples where we're seeing the shift. They'd started off as social registries for poverty targeting, and they're managing to move beyond that and start to cater to a wider range of programs. And this is also because they've started thinking beyond one flagship program. They started thinking across several programs. You'd be surprised at how many countries actually only have one program hinging on the country's social registry, and that is very problematic.
Can I just add, related to our last episode, and to your point, Valentina, Sharpie listeners might have heard Mamadou Diba, who's the National Coordinator for the National Social Protection Secretariat in the Gambia on our last episode, speaking to that very point. They're developing a social registry that he was at pains to tell us would be used for poverty targeting in some contexts, but for categorical programs in others. Rodrigo.
If you believe us, and many times we've seen that a poverty targeting approach is a mistake, and then on top of that, you do a restricted database that can only be used for poverty targeting, then you're making two mistakes. What I mean is you can have a bad program produce a good database that can advance your journey with your national data infrastructure. So, by all means, if you have political constrictions or a situation that you have very severe budgetary restrictions, or you have influence from multinational institutions and you need to react to those, at least don't ruin your database. At least don't ruin your perspective that afterwards you can evolve and do something broader and much more important. And in terms of cost, in terms of process, it is not that much more complicated.
Yeah, and if I could just quickly add, the second part of your question was about how your policy and targeting choices affect the way the information systems is constructed. This is exactly that. I mean, ultimately, the information system is the crystallization of those policy and targeting choices. It's about the policy, it's not about the data and the system. So think of it the other way around. Like, don't create a solution to a problem that isn't there. Just focus on what your problem is and what you really want to be doing with that data going forward across the social sector and work towards that. Ultimately, those of us working on this often say that these information systems, they're not good, they're not bad, they're never neutral. That's because we're the ones who influence the way they are designed. So let's influence them in the right direction.
And these policy choices that we are talking about are influenced by so many things, including political considerations. You know, we have seen countries that have had largely categorical universal programs take a turn back towards poverty targeting or means testing for political reasons, and programs going in the other direction as well. So although the methodology around targeting is hugely contentious in our field and is something we've discussed on other programs as well, I guess what I'm taking from this conversation is what you want is a system that can be flexible and have the data that enables it
A database. That distinction, I think, is important. It's not the system. The systems will change in different ways from the database. Databases are long duration artifacts and endeavors for society. You've got to keep them alive and dynamic and always improving in quality with the different capacities and considerations. On top of that, you're going to build management systems that will then be much more specific and much more reflective of the political struggles that are going to define the policies. Usually, when we talk IT, databases have to be planned for 20, 30 years. Management systems usually change less than 10 years because policy will change, laws will change. And then the interface changes every couple of years with each new technology that comes along. If you don't have these things layered independently, you always have to start from scratch. And that is not only profoundly wasteful, but will delay your process dramatically. So there needs to be some attention towards the independence, the functional independence of the database.
I wanted to ask you this question about inclusion and exclusion. When it comes to these databases, these registries, inclusion is the issue. You have to be in a registry or in a database in order to be even considered for inclusion in programs. It's an absolute threshold there. What are some of the challenges that you've grappled with over the years around improving inclusion, reducing exclusion in the construction of databases?
Again, think long term. The first challenge we faced was in 2003 when we were free nearly 4 years down the road from the start of Cadastro Único. We saw that the sub-registration, so the percentage of people in Brazil who did not have birth certificates, did not have proper documentation, was around 14%. So there was a big program around that, which run parallel from Cadastro Único. It was a demand from Cadastro Único, but was run by other institutions because it's a national problem. So we faced this, and over a couple of decades, things are much, much better now. Brazil has a chaotic ID system, which now we're managing to unify. And now we're managing to collect biometric data for everything. So we had to do things in a very overlapping parallel way because we had no unified identity. So that's one element. The other element is that for us, this is a database that is built with the collaboration of the state governments and the municipal governments. We are a very federative state. So we need to structure the whole social assistance system, which surpasses all these levels of government. And now we're rolling out in December the new version of CAD Único, the eighth version of the whole questionnaire and the systems and everything. And we're going to be training over 40,000 people just to collect this data. Because of political problems, we have people whose benefits have never been reviewed. And now we are starting this process. And this means building capacity for it. So this means calling back lots of people, reviewing their data, and also ask them to collect their biometrics. So we improve that aspect. You have all kinds of opportunities to structure this data in a better way. And this all, as I said, being cross-checked with dozens of other databases to provide indicators of problems. I'll give you an example from Social Security. Once we did a review of a city where we had some old age benefits, and then we found an address that had over 200 old age benefits. And we said, oh, this is a fraud. This must be some kind of scheme or something. And we sent people there. And there was a problem. But all the old age benefits were legitimate and correct. The problem was that address was an unregistered old people's home. So there was a problem, but nothing to do with Social Security. And of course, then the municipality has to go and see whether the conditions are right and if the registration is correct. So usually when we work with data, you cannot really know what is happening. You have hints, you have indicators, you have probabilities, but you have to go out and check.
Ultimately, I mean, the reason we're building all of this is to serve people better. And it's sometimes useful to think of the counterfactual. So, kind of going back a step and thinking, if we weren't doing it this way, how were we doing it? Or kind of what are other ways in which we could be doing this? There's the option, which in many countries still is the case, which each individual program is doing this separately. But again, that the audit trails, that the capacity to look across inclusion and exclusion when it's each individual program doing it is much less. If we're doing this once and well, and really we have full accountability, full transparency, all hands on decks across different ministries, across many actors, working together with municipalities, our frontline workforce to get this right, and really discovering the problems to inclusion and tackling them as we find them. One by one, they've been identifying systematic problems and addressing them systematically, which ultimately does make a lot more sense than each program sort of doing their own thing.
And this is building the concept in society, the concept of modern government. Most of these things are about trust as well. If you do this in the way Valentina is talking about, you're also building trust. You're also building an idea that government and these programs work in a rational manner with expected outcomes. And the way things are structured will teach the people how to relate to that. And this is constantly necessary. For example, we just had major floods in the south of Brazil. Nearly 700,000 people requested benefits, but we saw that over 250,000 of them, these benefits were not at all merited. So people who were not living in the flooded areas were also requesting benefits. Because if government is seen as a free for all opportunity for anything, then society will react this way. The capacity that we had to show that the benefits were reaching the flooded areas with all kinds of resources. This structures the way society relates to these benefits as not some kind of handout, but some kind of proper identification of help and need when these emergencies happen. And this, I think, is crucial because I actually believe for the next 20 years, there will be a huge stress on the social assistance for these climate related disasters. The idea that you can just do a poverty means test and then relate with the disasters that is happening and correlate that with an idea that people in the poorest percentile of the population will be more affected. That is not going to be as clean cut as our discussions 10, 15 years ago showed it. And that's where I go back. You need the tools to work that. And that, at least in my view, is mostly the data.
Thank you. That leads me very nicely to the next question, which was to talk about this challenge of making the data dynamic and keeping it up to date. It's always been the case that social protection systems are supposed to be able to respond effectively to people's changing circumstances, because we know even in the normal course of events, people experience shocks throughout the life course, or they change. They move from one stage to another. And as you've just said, it's becoming even more critical and potentially complex as we realise the need for more adaptive, shock responsive systems that can respond to these kinds of climate impacts. Valentina, can you tell us a little bit more about how other countries are looking at this challenge around making systems more dynamic?
Yes, so surprise, surprise, we're mostly out of the realm of technology again and out of the realm of digital, and we're back to the tough policy choices, because ultimately the problem is not so much, for example, with a social registry, but with a social registry that is intended as a fixed, kind of monolithic, huge, heavy thing that is done every once in a while, the kind of fixed list approach concept. So the teams sent around a country kind of once every X number of years, and then not even managing to do that because you realize that it's really expensive and then you don't have the budget 5 years down the line. And the problem of this fixed list approach is also a political economy one, because if you have a fixed list approach, you kind of know who will be receiving broadly. You can control the number of recipients, and that's sort of easy. It kind of, you can fix the budget around that. So it's the pressure, it's sort of managing to let go of that and managing to invest in the capacities that allow us to actually enable that. So it's investing in those frontline workers and the agreements with municipalities in order for them to be playing an active role in collecting the data is absolutely crucial when we're thinking about dynamism. So that would be my number one kind of focus. Think of Brazil and its thousands of CRAS centers around the countries who are doing the registration that Rodrigo was mentioning. Colombia, who's agreed with every single 1,100 municipalities so that they can play an active role. Mali has been investing in kind of a network of NGOs and kiosks where registration can be shifted to more on demand. South Africa has got a pretty impressive system of SASA offices and mobile teams roaming around the country and really digging deeper in areas where they identify higher levels of need or particular challenges to access. Cambodia has been making great progress on their commune officials. Obviously, it's not easy, and Pakistan and Indonesia, for example, have been investing on this a lot in recent years, piloting, testing out approaches and failing. And very often the failures are linked to political economy as well, because it's disagreements between central powers and decentralized powers in terms of not trusting the lists that arrive up to central level. I'm never saying that any of this is easy. It's incredibly complex, but we need to keep our eyes on this. We need to be jointly working on this. Then obviously there are some digital solutions because digital can help as well. So if we're thinking about increasing dynamism, the interoperability dimension is crucial. There's hundreds of countries that have shifted in this direction, all high-income countries. In some countries, you can even trigger benefits through interoperability. So Norway with its child benefits, data comes in, a new child is born, you may receive a benefit. But even Mongolia has managed to do this in periods of its history where the political will was there. Mauritania has recently managed to connect to the disability registry and is pulling that in to work on a disability benefit. So it is possible where the will is there. And when you say shock responsive, that brings a whole load of other questions on the table. What I know is that countries that have thought about the possibility of using their data for shocks, even just thinking through what needs to change if I want to use this data for shocks, is a crucial first step. So Malawi has been doing this for years and they've made big progress. They've thought through who might need to use this data? How will they be able to access it? Let's start writing up the SOPs. What might we be sharing? How can we use unique identifiers? What data is most useful to them? Let's bring them into the picture. Maybe they might have some data that's useful to us in terms of what are the regions of the country that are most frequently affected. So let's maybe collect a higher percentage of coverage data in those areas. So just starting those discussions with the humanitarian sector, DRM actors, starting to share those experiences can really bring countries onto a really important trajectory. And there's a lot more we could say on this, but I think that's enough for now.
In Brazil, the Ministry of Social Development, which takes care of both Bolsa Família and Cade Único, have two separate secretariats to do that. So there is a secretariat whose sole task is to keep Cade Único updated. And there are many more people in the cadastro than those that qualify for Bolsa Família. And that was crucial in COVID. In 6 days, we managed to pay emergency benefits for the beneficiaries. And then in another week, we managed to pay for all those included in Cadastro Único because the thresholds had changed. So having this database is incredibly important and has to be looked at a permanent way. We usually do not have the budget to include everybody that should in Bolsa Família. That is the yearly struggle with Congress, yearly struggle with the budget people, but the Cade Único is there, and it's always being treated. One of the very, very few and slight disagreements I have with Valentina, I am a data maximalist. I want to capture everything. And I'm sorry, these privacy nuts. Government needs to function. And after it functions, it can become a challenge. And then Big Brother might come along and we'll deal with that. Of course, I'm being very brief here. But at the moment, most governments need to function. And to function, they need data. Payroll database needs to come in. All kinds of the economic databases needs to come in. That's another mistake many countries do. They believe that the social assistance database is disconnected from economy. It's just something that has to be dealt with. And then you don't provide the links because underneath all of this, poverty is not a natural phenomenon. It's produced by the economy that it's in. It's produced by the way the country's economy relates internationally and nationally to all of the structures. All this provides data that needs to be understood in order to have a social assistance database as well. So you have to keep on collecting and processing this data. And then, as Valentina rightly said, social assistance data cannot be collected as census data every 10 years that you go out there and you take a picture. It doesn't work that way. You have to have constant bringing in of all kinds of different data to constitute the picture. For example, Brazil didn't pay any attention for addresses, and it was never relevant. For the first time, because of the floods, the address became the crucial element of the benefit because we're trying to target people who are actually flooded out of their houses. And then we're now developing a digital public infrastructure where people are going to be able to, through the app they already relate to government, declare which address they want to relate to government. So this is a very new thing. Whatever we build now is what we're going to have in our toolkit for tomorrow. That's why you need to build constantly.
Valentina, Rodrigo has just described himself as a data maximalist. Of course, a lot of the cost of this kind of data collection is in collecting the data. So what are some of the ways to reduce efforts and costs? Or perhaps, how can governments get the most out of the information that they do collect?
Yeah, so let me explain why I'm a bit more of a data minimalist. I've sort of come from recent research, kind of working alongside WFP and UNICEF in Sahel. And what really impressed me was just the number of countries that had these huge questionnaires, between 52 and 248 questions, on average about 100 questions, around 2.5 hours to complete these, with kind of teams going around the country. And when I actually looked at the data use and what variables were being used, it's literally just a handful. We're talking like 13 to 15 variables. It's almost nothing of that. And I'm not saying that it means we need to be collecting only 14 to 15 variables, but I think we just need to scrutinize a lot more carefully what we are collecting and why, and kind of work alongside our current and potential future users. Again, that future proofing, thinking to the future, what programs might be using our data, and being realistic about what we are collecting and why we're collecting it. So don't start collecting massive food security modules that look at what you've eaten over the past 7 days if that data is realistically only going to have a data validity of about 3 months, and not even that. And in fact, it could even mess up your data because of seasonality. If you're collecting data in two different parts of the country at different times, then it looks like one part of the country is a lot poorer, more food insecure than another area. You can do a lot more with pulling in data from other places, which actually makes it cheaper. We can also look at more flexible, more modular approaches to data collection. Niger has been exploring collecting just a sort of very base number of variables, and then additional actors can be collecting more, but linking them back to that data. Mauritania similarly has sort of collecting different amounts of data for different population groups based on certain characteristics. We were saying before, maybe recurrently shock affected areas, we might be collecting more data. So let's be a bit more strategic about what we collect and how we collect it.
Rodrigo, you've made some really important points about the way that people interact and interface with government. So it's about building trust. But you also briefly touched on the issues around privacy. And I think there's something about data, especially big data, maybe these registries that are sometimes in some countries making determinations about eligibility that people don't understand necessarily. Or there are certainly concerns and risks around storage, use of this kind of data, privacy, some of those things. So how do you respond to that? And how do you think about some of those challenges?
I think there's a huge obfuscation going on. I believe that we are being geared towards talking about government's abuse of privacy, which, don't get me wrong, not only they're possible, but they actually do happen. But that's concerning something like 2% of the data, because the private identification data is rather small compared to all your transactional data. And we're quite comfortable to provide all our data and our information to a drugstore or a supermarket and get discounts in produce and convenience in relationship. And we're okay with that. So I am dramatically more worried with the appropriation of our data by the private sector. I'm worried because there's a new actor in the field. We now have corporations who have bigger budget and arguably bigger firepower than governments. We have individual billionaires intervening in global conflicts personally. This is scary. So, unless we have the whole discussion, this whole data privacy thing, especially when it's only government, I think it's kind of a hoax, really.
Valentina, Rodrigo has talked us through the many evolutions of Cadastro Único, one of the original social registries.
Yeah.
It's been in operation for 25 years and changed in a whole range of ways.
The origin of the
you've
name
also-
single registries, Cadastro Único.
the one registry to rule them all. But, in terms of some of those new systems that you've been looking at recently, in countries where social protection systems are nascent and just being established, what are the trends in the way these registries and information systems are being built?
First of all, I'm quite glad to see that some countries, also thanks to support by, for example, the Digital Convergence Initiative and the World Bank and others, are starting to think beyond just, again, setting up that small MIS for the software for one function, that they're thinking more about the building block, that the digital public infrastructure that Rodrigo was mentioning. How can we think across government, across the government ecosystem? How can we work with the Ministry of Digital Transformation to get things right from the start? Let's get our data standards in place. Let's kind of think things through beyond the social protection sector only, and kind of align with what other sectors are doing and the broader e-governance transformation is doing. I've appreciated that in some countries we're starting to think beyond just the social registry function. I think a lot of countries have really obsessed on that one thing. Let's get a social registry, rather than think through where should data be flowing to and from for my sector to work better for the people we're trying to serve. And so those other functions, the integrated beneficiary registry function, the integration of payments, of grievance mechanisms, embedding the systems in legislation, thinking about data protection. I know it's not a kind of favorite of Rodrigo's, but still for a government to be sort of systematically assessing the extent to which it can guarantee that minimum data protection. There's really good guidance coming from the Convergence Initiative on this that I'd invite you to go and take a look at. So that broader governance piece, and also more people getting involved, kind of policy people realizing that ultimately, because these systems mediate who receives and who doesn't receive, who's in, who's out, we need to get involved. We need to really keep the scrutiny high, kind of join in the meetings, like coordinate around these, because it's not just a data thing. It's not something we can hand off to the IT expert. We need to all get our hands dirty and realize that we will be making mistakes, but yeah, get involved.
Rodrigo, Assumpção and Valentina, Barca, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you both. It was very, very nice.
Bye, everyone.
Before we go, we like to end each episode with some quick wins. We ask our guests to bring in some recommendations for research, news, or events that have sparked their interest and that we think you should know more about. Joining us for Quick Wins today is Gabrielle Smith, who is an independent consultant working in social protection and humanitarian assistance in fragile and conflict-affected settings. She's a member of the technical senior leadership team for FCDO's STAR Social Protection Advisory Facility. Welcome to the Social Protection Podcast, Gabrielle.
Thanks, Jo. I'm very happy to be here.
So at the time of recording, it's the end of October, and FCDO has just convened a 3-day global forum on social protection in fragility and conflict, which brought together, I believe, around 150 people from all over the world to strengthen global action on social protection in situations of acute, rapid onset and protracted conflicts. I actually wanted to ask you first about the interesting way the forum unfolded over those 3 days. Can you describe the format a little bit and what do you think it achieved?
Yes, I found the format of the event quite interesting. I've never experienced a setup like that before. The main thing I found of interest was the event was led by the audience. So the first day was structured as a knowledge forum. We had pre-prepared content and there was an emphasis on active participation. It wasn't just a one-way information sharing. But then the second day and the third day were really different. On day 2, we attended something that was called a concilium, and there was no preset agenda at all. Instead, all the participants could share topics that were of interest to them to discuss, and anyone who wanted to join a session could do so. So you had, over the course of the day, multiple parallel dynamic sessions. Each one had a summary of the issue and initial reflections on things we could do to tackle those issues. And then on the last day, we came back together into something called the Senate. And here the discussions from day 2 informed the setting of 6 or 7 priority themes. So they were on things like finance, coordination, social protection workforce, operational models, conflict sensitivity. There was a few more as well. And so in groups, we had to propose actions under these themes to improve social protection in settings of conflict and fragility. And then everyone voted. And then the top actions made it into something called a charter of things to be ideally taken forward. in policy and practice. So we as forum attendees actually created the content. We identified the issues, we define the actions. And that as a participant was certainly more enjoyable for me than listening to a lot of other people talk for 3 days.
So, what were some of those key actions and recommendations that you all identified and that went into that charter?
Yeah, so we developed this charter. It was called a Charter for Action. And I think we voted in about 14 or 15 critical areas for change. And this is actually going to be published. So watch this space for the full details. But I can share, as an example, we had discussions on operational models. And in those discussions, we noted that there were benefits of international actors supporting social protection delivery in conflict settings. But we also talked a lot about the risks of this approach from a system building perspective. And so then there was inclusion in the charter of a recommendation that where third-party implementers are used, we need clear plans that guide a transition back to government-led ways of working. And we had a lot of discussion on what engaging with government in conflict actually means. So there was a lot of emphasis that government is not just a single entity. And so the charter recognises that these decisions on whether to engage with government or not, they're not a simple binary yes-no decision. But what we should be doing is identifying which parts of government can be engaged with. There were also recommendations there on the need to better balance humanitarian principles with social protection principles. There were also issues with donor financing. And so the charter then calls on donors to commit to a new framework for financing social protection in fragility and conflict that is more risk tolerant and flexible. And I think it's worth noting that the actions in the charter, they are phrased at quite a high level. So there's still a need to develop specifics, I think, on the how part. So while the charter is an important outcome in itself, I think we need to see it as marking the start of a process in a way. And I'm really hoping that we see sustained momentum on that in the coming months.
Thank you. Localization is a key theme when we're talking about operating in fragile and conflict affected contexts, and indeed in humanitarian situations writ large. That's empowering local actors to deliver assistance, responding to local needs as they see them. It's a big and ongoing shift in the sector. So I'd just be interested to hear about whether that was something that was discussed, and particularly what perhaps some of these local actors had to say about how that localization project is going, whether it's going far enough, and how it's been working for them.
Yes, localization did come up during the forum, and there were actors present that represent local organisations and national organisations from conflict settings. And the general picture at the end of the forum was it isn't going far enough. So we heard that it's international organisations that are generally being contracted to provide implementation support to social protection in conflict settings. And then these organisations subcontract national or local organisations to manage parts of implementation. So what we heard participants saying is that these national and local organisations clearly have certain comparative advantages. We're hearing that they're important for things like building trust with communities, and for building an understanding of conflict dynamics in the country, for negotiating access, for outreach to communities, for parts of delivery. And then participants were also questioning the cost efficiency of an international pass-through approach compared to if local actors were contracted directly to do these tasks. There's a study that's just been published by the Share Trust. It's called Passing the Buck, and it shows in humanitarian aid that contracting nationals directly could be something like 30% more cost efficient than this current international subcontracting model. And if we think about it logically, the same argument could apply to these social protection ways of working.
It's interesting, isn't it, that conversation around sort of localization, local actors, but also connecting that back to some of the points you were making earlier about working with government and who's in that leadership role at different times. We will put a link to that report that you've mentioned. It's definitely worth a read. And localization is a topic we're hoping to explore on this podcast, hopefully in the new year. Gabrielle, thank you so much for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
It was a pleasure. Thanks.
And thank you for listening to the Social Protection Podcast, brought to you by socialprotection.org. You can find all of our episodes on the socialprotection.org website and on your favourite podcast platforms. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review. Back next month. See you then.